The Greyhound bus rattled to a stop on a gravel road 12 miles southeast of Dallas, Texas. Through dust-streaked windows, Margarete Hoffman pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Her fingers, still marked with the grime of 3 days' travel from Ellis Island, trembled as they gripped the seat back before her. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times during the crossing from Bremerhaven, through the interrogation rooms of New York, across the vast emptiness of America. She had prepared herself for barbed wire, for guard towers, for the gray concrete walls that had consumed her cousin in Ravensbrück. She had steeled her heart for starvation, for cruelty, for the systematic degradation she had been told awaited all enemies of the Reich captured by the Americans. But nothing, not the propaganda lectures, not the whispered warnings of other prisoners, not even her own darkest imaginings had prepared her for what stood before her now. Red brick, expansive lawns, flower beds bursting with summer blooms. The iron gate swung open, and Margarete stepped into a lie so vast, so complete, that it would take weeks for her mind to accept what her eyes were seeing. The architecture of Expectations Camp Seagoville had not been built as a prison. It had been conceived in 1940 as a federal reformatory for women, designed by progressive architects who believed that rehabilitation required dignity, that transformation demanded beauty. The facility sprawled across 72 acres of North Texas prairie, organized not as a fortress, but as a campus. 22 cottages, each housing 30 women, radiated from a central dining hall and administration building. Between them ran paths shaded by young oak trees, bordered by beds of zinnias and marigolds, that someone, an American guard, a trustee, perhaps even a previous inmate, had planted and now tended with inexplicable care. For the German women arriving in the summer of 1943, this architecture represented an ontological impossibility. They had departed a Germany where every calorie was counted, where ersatz coffee made from acorns had become a luxury, where soap was a memory and butter a distant dream. They had lived for years under a regime that had taught them a fundamental truth about the world, that America was weak, decadent, collapsing under the weight of its own Jewish corruption and racial confusion. The Führer himself had declared that the mongrel American soldier, soft from jazz music and Hollywood fantasies, would crumble before the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht. And yet here stood these buildings, solid and clean and impossibly well maintained, suggesting a different truth entirely. Elsa Bergman, who had taught mathematics at a gymnasium in Hamburg before her arrest, would later write in a smuggled letter to her sister, "We expected to find the ruins of a dying empire. Instead, we found a nation that could afford to house its prisoners in what resembled a small university. This was the first crack in everything we had been told. It was also the most terrifying." The cottage of disbelief. Margarete was assigned to Cottage 7, a single-story structure that could have been lifted from any middle-class neighborhood in Austin or Fort Worth. The front door, painted white, unlocked, opened onto a common room with upholstered chairs and a radio that actually worked. Beyond it, a corridor led to individual rooms, each measuring roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, each containing a single bed with a metal frame, a dresser with 3 drawers, a wooden chair, and a window with curtains. Curtains. The detail struck Margarete with physical force. She stood in the doorway of her assigned room, staring at the pale blue fabric that hung on either side of the glass pane, and felt something crack inside her chest. Curtains implied privacy. Curtains implied that the people who lived here were considered human beings capable of creating a personal space, not animals to be warehoused and watched. In the holding facility at Ellis Island, they had slept in open dormitories under lights that never dimmed. During the crossing, they had been packed into the hold of a converted freighter, sleeping in shifts on narrow cots separated only by hanging blankets. But here, in this impossible place, she had a room with a door that closed and curtains that could be drawn. "Don't touch anything," hissed Anna Schultz, a younger woman who had been arrested in Guatemala and spoke with the paranoid certainty of the recently traumatized. "It's a trick. They want us to get comfortable and then they'll take it all away. Or worse, They'll photograph us using these luxuries and use it for propaganda. See how well the Germans live while American boys die. The theory was logical, even plausible. It was also wrong. That first afternoon, a guard, a woman in her 40s with gray streaking her dark hair, appeared in the doorway of Cottage 7 carrying a stack of linens. "Fresh sheets on Thursdays," she announced in flat Midwestern English that none of the German women fully understood. She demonstrated on one of the beds, bottom sheet, top sheet, 2 pillowcases, a wool blanket. Then she pointed at the bathroom at the end of the hall. "Hot water from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. You want a bath? You take a bath. Just clean up after yourselves." And then she left. No lecture, no list of rules and punishments, no demonstration of power. Margarete stood frozen for a full minute after the guard departed. Then, moving as if in a trance, she walked to the bathroom and turned one of the faucets marked with an H. Water flowed immediately, steam rising within seconds. She held her hand under the stream until it burned, until she had to pull away with a gasp. The water kept flowing, hot and abundant, and seemingly endless. She twisted the faucet closed and sat on the edge of the bathtub, shaking. In Hamburg, in the final months before her arrest, hot water had been rationed to 1 bath per week, and even that was considered a luxury. Most families heated water on the stove in small amounts, washing 1 piece of their body at a time. The gas had been cut off so frequently that cooking often meant huddling around a single electric hot plate, preparing meals that consisted mostly of black bread, potatoes, and turnips. And here, in a prison camp for enemy nationals in a country supposedly on the brink of collapse, hot water flowed freely, 24 hours a day. That night, after the sun had set and the June heat had finally broken, Margarete lay in her bed with the window open, listening to the sound of cicadas in the darkness. The sheet smelled of soap, real soap, not the gray industrial bars that left your skin feeling raw. The pillow beneath her head was soft, filled with actual feathers rather than straw or wood shavings. Somewhere in the cottage someone was crying, the sound muffled by a closed door and personal grief. But Margarete was not crying. She was thinking. And what she was thinking terrified her more than any barbed wire or guard tower ever could. If this was a prison, what did freedom look like? If this was how America treated its enemies, what did it do for its own people? And if the regime had lied about this, lied so completely, so comprehensively, about something so easily verifiable, what else had been a lie? The bread that broke the world. The dining hall opened at 6:30 the next morning. Margarete joined the line of women shuffling through the entrance, clutching the metal tray she had been issued the night before. The room was large, bright with morning sun streaming through tall windows. It smelled of coffee. Real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute they had been drinking in Germany since 1940. At the serving line, a black woman in a white uniform stood behind a steam table. Without speaking, she began filling Margarete's tray. 2 fried eggs, 4 strips of bacon, a pile of fried potatoes, a small bowl of canned peaches swimming in syrup, a glass of milk, and finally, from a basket lined with a clean cloth, 2 slices of bread. White bread, soft, refined, wheat bread with no coarse grain, no sawdust filler, no stretching additives that made it taste like cardboard. Bread like Margarete had not seen since her childhood, when her father had brought home a loaf from the Jewish bakery on Grindelally, before such things became impossible, before Grindelally became Grindelay, and the bakery became a vacant building with broken windows. Margarete stood at the end of the serving line, staring at her tray, unable to move forward. Behind her, another woman bumped into her back, muttered an apology. The collision broke the spell. Margarete stumbled to the nearest table and sat down. Around her, other women were experiencing their own private revolutions. Inga Müller, who had been a nurse in Costa Rica before her internment, was crying openly as she spread butter, real yellow butter, not margarine, on her bread. Frida Kessler, an older woman whose husband had been arrested separately and sent to a different camp, was simply staring at her plate, her fork hovering in the air, as if waiting for permission to believe what she was seeing. At a table near the windows, a woman Margarete didn't know had already begun eating. She was shoving food into her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face, her body convulsing with sobs even as she chewed and swallowed. No one stopped her. No one commented. They all understood. Margarete cut a piece of egg with the edge of her fork. The yolk broke, spreading golden across the white. She lifted the fork to her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue, salt and fat and protein, flavors so intense after years of deprivation that they felt almost obscene. She swallowed and immediately cut another piece. She was halfway through her breakfast when she saw Anna Schultz wrapping her bacon in a napkin, slipping it into the pocket of her dress. Others were doing the same, hiding bread, secreting away pieces of fruit, hoarding against the inevitable day when this abundance would be revealed as the cruel joke it surely had to be. But that day never came. The next morning, there were eggs again, and bacon, and white bread. The morning after that, it was pancakes with maple syrup and sausage links. The fourth morning brought oatmeal with brown sugar, raisins, and all the milk you could drink. On Sunday, there was fried chicken and mashed potatoes for lunch. On Wednesday, pork chops appeared with green beans and corn on the cob. By the end of the first week, Anna Schultz had stopped hoarding food, not because she trusted the Americans, but because her pockets and pillowcase were already stuffed with so many hidden rolls and pieces of fruit that she had nowhere left to hide anything. The abundance had overwhelmed even paranoia. "They're fattening us," Anna declared one evening, still searching for a logical explanation. "They want us healthy for propaganda films or prisoner exchanges." But the film crews never came. The exchange negotiations never materialized. The food just kept arriving, 3 times a day, 7 days a week, with a consistency that was itself a form of psychological warfare, the education of defeat. The unspoken curriculum of Camp Seagoville was not taught in classrooms, though those existed too. The administrators had organized English lessons, typing classes, and a surprisingly well-stocked library. No, the real education happened in moments of recognition, small apocalypses of understanding that accumulated until the old world could no longer hold. For Margarete, the decisive moment came in late June, almost 3 weeks after her arrival. She had been assigned to work in the camp laundry, a duty she had dreaded, but which turned out to be remarkably bearable. The machines were new, electric, efficient. There was hot water and plenty of soap. But it was during a water break, sitting on a bench outside the laundry building, that Margarete had her revelation. She was eating an apple, fresh, crisp, probably from California or Washington State, though she didn't know American geography well enough to be certain. As she bit into it, she happened to glance at the parking area where the guards left their personal vehicles. There were perhaps 15 cars visible, ranging from modest Fords to a sleek Buick that belonged to one of the senior administrators. 15 cars, for perhaps 20 guards at this facility. In Hamburg, before the war, her father had been a successful architect. The family had been prosperous by any reasonable standard, and yet they had owned no car. Neither had their neighbors, nor most of the people they knew. Private automobiles had been luxuries, possessions of the wealthy elite, objects of aspiration rather than casual ownership. But here, the guards, women earning what couldn't be more than modest government salaries, each drove their own car to work. They parked them casually, without guards or special protection, as if personal automobiles were as common as bicycles had been in Germany. Margarete looked at the apple in her hand, then at the cars, then back at the apple. The math was simple and devastating. If even the guards at a federal prison for enemy nationals could afford personal automobiles, if fresh fruit from thousands of miles away could be served daily to prisoners, if white bread and butter and unlimited hot water were considered standard provisions for the detained, Germany had already lost the war, not tactically, not yet. The Wehrmacht was still fighting, still holding territory, still inflicting casualties, but strategically, economically, in all the ways that mattered for sustained industrial warfare against a continental superpower, Germany had lost before the first shot was fired. You could not defeat a nation that produced so much excess wealth that it casually gave to its prisoners what the Reich could not provide to its own soldiers. That evening, Margarete lay in her bed with the window open, listening to the sound of a guard's car starting in the parking lot, its engine turning over smoothly, effortlessly, before pulling away into the Texas night. She thought about her father, who would be in his study now if he was still alive, working by candlelight because the electricity had been cut off again. She thought about her younger brother, conscripted into the army at 17, sent to Russia with boots that fell apart after 3 weeks and a rifle that jammed in the cold. She thought about the white bread she had hidden in her dresser drawer that morning and how she had finally thrown it away that afternoon because it had gone stale and there would be more tomorrow. And for the first time since her arrest, Margarete allowed herself to cry, not from fear or anger or even grief, but from the terrible, liberating realization that everything she had believed about the world had been wrong. The invisible wound. Not all the women in Camp Seagoville arrived directly from Germany. Some, like Margarete, had been arrested in Latin America, where German communities had lived for generations. Others had been living in the United States for years or even decades before December 7th, 1941, when everything changed. But a handful arrived with different stories entirely, women who had been caught in the machinery of war itself, who carried wounds both visible and hidden. Helene Richter arrived at Camp Seagoville in August of 1943, transferred from a military hospital in North Carolina. She was 28 years old, hollow-eyed, and walked with a pronounced limp. Unlike the other women, she had never been a civilian detainee. She had been a combatant, or rather a victim of combat, captured when the truck she had been riding in was struck by American artillery during the North African campaign. Helene did not speak of what had happened to her in any detail, but the visible evidence was clear enough. A badly healed fracture in her left leg, shrapnel scars across her back and shoulders, and a haunted quality in her eyes that suggested the invisible wounds went deeper than the physical ones. What shocked Helene, more than the capture itself, more than the chaos of battle or the terror of injury, was what happened next. She had been pulled from the wreckage of the truck by American medics who had every reason to leave her there. She was the enemy. She was a woman fighting with German forces, which made her an aberration, a creature outside the normal categories of warfare. And yet they had loaded her onto a stretcher, carried her to a field hospital, and operated on her immediately. Not after the American wounded had been treated, not as an afterthought or an act of reluctant obligation. Immediately. A surgeon, Captain Thomas Williams, she learned later, a doctor from Michigan with steady hands and a quiet manner, had spent 6 hours repairing the damage to her leg, removing shrapnel from her back, closing wounds that would have killed her within days from infection. He had done this while American soldiers lay dying in adjacent tents, while his own countrymen bled and screamed and called for morphine. When Helene had asked why, weeks later, when she could finally speak enough English to frame the question, Captain Williams had looked at her with genuine confusion. "You were injured," he said, as if this explained everything. "You needed surgery." There was no waiting line, no triage category for enemy combatants to be treated if time allows. There was only medical necessity and professional duty, applied without distinction or delay. For Helene, this was more disorienting than any ideology, more devastating than any propaganda. She had been raised in a world where value was hierarchical, where some lives mattered more than others based on race, nationality, political reliability. The idea that an American doctor would prioritize her broken leg over the comfort of his own wounded soldiers was not merely surprising, it was philosophically incomprehensible. At Camp Seagoville, Helene's injury became a kind of silent testimony. The other women could see her limp, could watch her struggle on bad days when the weather changed and old fractures ached. They could see that she had been wounded and that she had survived, not through luck or accident, but because the enemy had chosen to save her. This fact sat uneasily alongside everything they had been taught. If Americans were capable of such mercy toward a woman who had fought against them, what did that say about the stories they had been told of American barbarism? And if the Americans could afford to extend such care even to enemies, what did that imply about the relative strength of the two nations? Margarete befriended Helene slowly, carefully, through small gestures and shared silences. They would sit together in the common room of Cottage 7, reading or mending clothes, not speaking but finding comfort in each other's presence. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Helene finally spoke about Captain Williams. "He smiled at me," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the radio. "Before the surgery, when I was terrified and certain I would die, he smiled and told me I would be fine, and I believed him. Not because I wanted to, but because I could see that he believed it, that he would make it true." She paused, her fingers still on the sock she had been darning. "They could have let me die. They should have let me die. Their own men needed that operating table, that blood, that time. But they didn't, and I don't know what to do with that." Margarete understood. She understood perfectly, because the bread and the bacon and the hot water and the curtains and the cars in the parking lot had all been asking her the same impossible question, and she still had no answer. What do you do when the enemy turns out to be more humane than your own people? What do you do when captivity offers more dignity than freedom did? What do you do when everything you believed about good and evil, strength and weakness, righteousness and corruption is revealed to be a carefully constructed lie? You sit in a cottage in Texas, darning socks under electric light, eating white bread with butter, and you try not to think too hard about what comes next. The transformation, the psychological metamorphosis of the women at Camp Seagoville did not happen all at once. It was not a dramatic conversion, a sudden awakening to truth. Instead, it was a gradual erosion, a slow collapse of certainties under the weight of accumulated evidence. Some women resisted longer than others. Anna Schultz continued to insist, even months into her internment, that the comfort was a trick, that hardship was coming, that any day now the mask would slip and the true face of American cruelty would be revealed. She hoarded food until it rotted. She refused to take English classes, seeing them as a form of collaboration. She maintained a rigid inner distance from everything the camp offered, as if accepting comfort would be a betrayal of her homeland. But even Anna could not fully sustain her resistance. The body has its own intelligence, its own memory. After months of sleeping on a real mattress, of eating regular meals, of bathing in hot water, the body begins to expect these things. It relaxes. It heals. And with the healing of the body comes, inevitably, a softening of the mind. By the winter of 1943, Anna had begun attending English classes. She told herself it was purely practical. She needed to understand her captors. But the lessons were taught by a patient teacher named Mrs. Anderson, who brought cookies to class and never raised her voice, and who insisted on calling the women students rather than prisoners. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Anna began to enjoy the classes. She liked the puzzle of English grammar, the satisfaction of mastering new vocabulary, the camaraderie of learning alongside other women who were also trying to make sense of this strange new world. For Margarete, the transformation was marked by a specific incident. In early December, a package arrived for her, forwarded through the Red Cross from her aunt in Switzerland. Inside was a letter, written in careful code to evade the censors, describing conditions in Hamburg. The city had been devastated by firebombing that summer. Tens of thousands were dead. Her childhood neighborhood no longer existed. Her father's architecture firm had been destroyed. There was no word on whether her parents or brother had survived. Margarete read the letter 3 times, then walked outside into the cold Texas night. She stood on the lawn between the cottages, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the absence of city lights. And she made a decision. She would survive this war. She would learn English. She would eat the white bread and be grateful for it. She would accept the strange mercy of her captors. And when the war ended, because it would end, she understood that now, with absolute certainty, she would go home, and rebuild whatever was left to rebuild. But she would never, ever believe again that strength came from cruelty, or that deprivation built character, or that a nation's greatness could be measured by its willingness to sacrifice its own people. The lesson of Camp Seagoville was not about American virtue or German sin. It was simpler and more profound, that prosperity made mercy possible, that abundance enabled dignity, that a nation wealthy enough to feed its prisoners well had already won any war before the first battle was fought. The liberation that wasn't Camp Seagoville was officially closed in July of 1945, 2 months after VI Day. The women were released, repatriated, or transferred to other facilities depending on their individual circumstances. For many, the prospect of liberation was complicated by an uncomfortable truth. They were leaving a place of relative comfort to return to a devastated homeland where survival itself was uncertain. Margarete sailed back to Germany in August aboard a converted troop ship. The crossing took 12 days. She shared a cabin with 5 other repatriates, all women, all uncertain about what awaited them. They spoke little during the voyage, as if words might break the fragile shell of hope they had each constructed around themselves. Hamburg, when she finally reached it, was unrecognizable. The city of her childhood. Grand buildings, wide boulevards, the commercial bustle of a great port had been reduced to rubble. People lived in cellars and bombed-out basements. Food was scarce, rationed at levels that made wartime restrictions look generous. There was no running water in most of the city, no electricity, no gas. The black market thrived. Prostitution and petty crime were epidemic. Children with hollow eyes and distended bellies begged on corners. And Margarete, walking through these ruins with a small suitcase containing everything she owned, found herself thinking about white bread. It became a kind of touchstone, a measure of the distance between what she had known and what she now faced. In Texas, there had been white bread every day, so abundant that she had eventually stopped marveling at it, had begun taking it for granted. Now, in the city of her birth, there was only black bread when there was bread at all. Coarse, heavy loaves that tasted of sawdust and left your stomach aching. She thought about the guards' cars in the parking lot, about hot water that ran 24 hours a day, about butter and eggs and bacon and fresh fruit. She thought about Captain Williams, who had saved Helene's life because she needed surgery, because he was a doctor, and that was what doctors did. And she understood finally and completely why Germany had lost. Not because of strategy or tactics, not because of Hitler's mistakes or Allied superiority, but because of something more fundamental. Germany had built an empire on cruelty, on the idea that strength came from the willingness to inflict suffering. But America, for all its flaws, for all its contradictions and hypocrisies, had built a civilization on abundance, on the radical proposition that there could be enough for everyone, even for enemies. In the end, it was no contest at all. The bread of memory. Margarete Hoffman lived until 2003, dying at the age of 87 in a small apartment in Berlin. She had rebuilt her life slowly, working as a translator, never marrying, never having children. She rarely spoke of the war years, and almost never mentioned Camp Seagoville. But one night in 1998, sitting with a young graduate student researching the internment of Germans in the United States, she finally told her story. She described the cottages, the curtains, the hot water, the cars in the parking lot. She described the white bread that had arrived every morning, abundant and inexplicable. People think of prison camps and they think of suffering, she said, her voice thin but steady. And we did suffer in our way. We were separated from our families, held against our will, uncertain of our fates. But the suffering was not physical. It was psychological. It was the suffering of having your entire understanding of the world dismantled piece by piece, meal by meal. She paused, looking out the window at the lights of modern Berlin, a city rebuilt and transformed beyond anything she could have imagined in 1945. I was hungry for 3 years after I returned to Germany, she continued, truly hungry, in a way I had not been even before my arrest. And every day I thought about that camp, about the food we had complained about because we were stupid and did not understand how lucky we were. I thought about the white bread, and I hated myself for missing it, for missing a prison. She shook her head slowly. But it taught me something important. It taught me that systems matter, that how a society treats its enemies reveals everything about its true character. The Americans could afford to feed us well because they had built a system that generated abundance. We could not feed our own people because we had built a system that required sacrifice, that glorified suffering, that treated human beings as expendable resources. The graduate student asked if she harbored any resentment toward the Americans for holding her. Margarete was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "No resentment. Only a terrible, persistent sadness for what we could have been if we had chosen differently, if we had built a country where everyone had enough bread." The interview ended shortly after. The graduate student thanked her, packed up his recording equipment, and left. Margarete sat in her apartment for a while, thinking about Texas, about red brick cottages and summer lawns, about white bread and butter and eggs served on a metal tray to women who had expected to starve. Then she made herself a cup of tea and went to bed, sleeping soundly in a country that had learned slowly and painfully and at devastating cost that cruelty was never strength, and that the only empire worth building was one where even prisoners had enough to eat.